Okay, here we're going to show something new about dire wolves in an article that came out from nature.com, but we're also going to talk about a concept here before we get into the article about convergence. I've made reference to this before a few times, but convergence in its probably simplest form of explanation is whenever two totally different creatures over time end up being very similar to each other. In fact, one easy form and is used quite often in teaching this form is that there's a vine snake in the Congo in Africa and a vine snake in the Amazon that are mimicking the little pestle that comes out of the end of a vine as it's coiled around a tree, and they sit in that tree very still and wait for prey, and the prey that comes by are no wiser until it's too late. But they both look exactly like each other, but genetically, they're not even correlated. In fact, the type of snake that they originally derived from is not the same, but they devised this little plan to look like the vines, and the vines are very similar, and they come out very similar. It's always stated that they really can't tell the difference unless you're a guy that's into snakes. And um, there's one on exhibit at the Dallas World Aquarium down here downtown that's the Amazon version because it's a full Amazon type expedition thing. Another thing that can show convergence is if you study saltwater. And one neat thing that people don't think of in saltwater, I mean, they always think about the bigger fish and sharks and dolphins and things like that, but don't think about the exotic, beautiful fish that you could keep in captivity. But the other things that in captivity, as long as you can keep them with the fish that don't eat them, and it's a natural prey, are types of crustaceans, crabs, and shrimps. And there's at least 13, and I guess, no, I'm sorry, 31 variations of crab formed creatures that have derived from non crabbish formed creatures to over time form into crabs. Are things that whenever you look at it, you would instantly call that, well, that's a crab. One interesting one is a squat lobster, and you can look up squat lobster and find out that it's also known as porcelain crabs and so on because of the look of the popular one. They have little filter feeding arms that come out, not even really pinchers and everything, but they also have a tail that they keep tucked up under their body, and if you folded that out, it really looks like somebody stepped on a little bitty lobster and squished it out. The forebody around the chest there and thorax and things spreading out, looking very round all of a sudden, and it's convergence where he's trying to look like a crab. And a lot of this is like a linear convergence where it's things that are closely related just up the tree one or two notches, and that's what a dire wolf has a connection of rather than a direct lineage where a lot of people, until probably this paper came out, would think that a dire wolf would be something or some type of convergence where they would, or not convergence, but an actual um, form that our current gray wolves and stuff came from. And due to the last ice age and all the crap that happened was so bad that all we're really left with is the gray wolf, and he's much smaller now. So you get that insular dwarfism effect, but because of bad things happen. That happened to even humans here, where we see Cro-Magnon being eking on 7 foot quite often and regularly, and then all of a sudden people, especially in certain areas, got driven down to a little over 5 foot and came back up from that. And a lot of that was recently too. You can find castles and things that the doorways you'd really have to stoop under now. But also, whenever you have this thing that's called convergence, sometimes what we're really looking at is a hybrid form. And because we no longer have the form in front of us, a lot of scientists will take and look at this and tell you that it may be a new form, another one that adds to the tree, and so on. But what we're really looking at, I believe, in most cases, I would say a lot, if not most, are a hybrid type form, where what we're seeing is a close relative who's able to breed with that creature and end up giving it a more closer appearance to where archaeology wants to throw them in there because it's somewhat of a half breed. In fact, I made a video about this about a year and a half ago, not even about dire wolves, but I think they were mentioned during it, but we talked about jackals and different types of coyotes and creatures like that, and how the jackal has now been reclassified due to genetics. They find out that even though it really looks like this, it's one of those. And the Egyptian wolf and so on that we have going on off here, and what's really a jackal and what's really a wolf. And of course you see in the Egyptian things the jackal and so on coming of that, but then an Anubis creature and so on. So dire wolves, though, were the last of an ancient New World canid lineage. So they're basically based out of and derived in the New World out of creatures that were over here in the Americas and came from that. So just read the abstract here and we'll get on to it. Dire wolves are considered to be one of the most common and widespread large carnivores in the Pleistocene America, or coming out of the last ice age, yet relatively little is known about their evolution or extinction. Here to reconstruct the evolutionary history of dire wolves, we sequenced 5 genomes from subfossil remains dating from 13,000 years ago to more than 50,000 years ago. So this is basically during the time that they died off at the end of the last ice age, but also back to 50,000 years ago. Our results indicate that although they were similar morphologically to the extant or still existing gray wolf, dire wolves were a highly divergent lineage that split from living canids around 5.7 million years ago. So in the Wayback Machine, about 2 steps back. In contrast to numerous examples of hybridization across canidae, there is no evidence for gene flow between dire wolves and either North American gray wolves or even coyotes. So in that statement right there, they're showing you that, canines have a huge cross too, but everybody's always said, well, we got the dogs from wolves. And that's not true. It's from a step back and a thing that was much more like a dog than a wolf. Sure, we have these husky forms in Siberian and snow dogs that we know of and so on, and they're much more closer to wolves. But then there are other dogs that we've talked about, like the Canaanite hound that comes from Canaan and around the Middle East and so on, in a few different forms that already, as they were going to convergence somewhat, came from the same type of creature way back and then derived slightly variations, where one had a longer snout than the other, or more jowly appearance of a Canaanite type hound that leads to even jowlier things like pit bulls and boxers, which look totally different than, say, a German Shepherd and so on. And of course we realize that modern genetics is trying to show us these things, but we also realize that the humans, having befriended dogs tens of thousands of years ago, have derived quite a few different forms of them. And due to having different forms form out over time through genetically messing with them much more fast than would happen out in the wild in any way, and then reintroducing them back to each other, coming up with a third form that pulls off a different trait that's slightly stronger, and then breeding to that trait. Or taking something that is the runt and then breeding to the runt and end up getting with a miniature version. And we see a lot of those today. And there's a convergence goes on with things like Lhasa Apso and Shih Tzus and so on, and Pekingese dogs that look very similar with each other. Then there are other things that we picked and genetically got to go, and a miniature pinscher or a min pin isn't really a miniature Doberman at all. It's another type of dog that looks kind of that shape, and especially when you get it small and pull off the same color forms of black and the orange eyes, spots on the eyebrows and so on, looks ironically like it. I myself now have a Jack Russell Terrier that we've gotten for the girls here, and we're unpuppying that thing. But let me tell you, Jack Russells are full of puppy until the end. And a German Shepherd, black German Shepherd. And these are very radical differences. And sure, a regular German Shepherd looks a little wolfish, and you can see more connective there definitely than you can to a Jack Russell Terrier. They're almost totally different type of dogs. And, one's made to fight foxes and attack foxes and things like that. And that again is a type of convergence. So not only do we have a bunch of saltwater crustaceans trying to turn out to be crabs, and then there's of course a myriad of things on land and in ocean that tried to converge to end up being types of worms, that I guess you could pull snakes out of that too, because they no longer don't have a locomotion that involves arms and legs and so on. But this happened way back at 5.7 million years ago, and then looking at the genetics, they go, no, there's not even any gene flow as far as a hybridation of what we think of as a dire wolf. And of course, everybody's thinking of this giant wolf, either in a vampire kissing movie or in Game of Thrones or things like that. And I thought about starting this off on that Ark game that I was on, that I showed Land of the Lost, and the idea, because they have them in that, and they're not too egregiously large like they are in those movies and the shows that are like that, because looking at the skeletons and things, they're not that much larger. It's kind of like, I don't know, a German Shepherd to a Great Dane, where you go, it's a little bigger, but it's not anything that would show as being super, sized or taller than that. And that even looks like it's a hybrid form, and that hybrid form, what it did give the animal is a bigger appearance. But of course, back in that last Pleistocene era, a lot of things were bigger, mammoths and so on. And we can see the deviation on a theme of that convergence, but not, in mastodons and mammoths and woolly rhinos. And then we still have elephants today and rhinos, but they aren't the woolly form in any way, shape, or form. And those facts, they actually lived on an island off of Siberia for a little while. But we also have a lot of forms and versions of dwarf or pygmy elephants. Well, we have that in people too. There's dwarf and pygmy people. And there are regular sized people, and there are the people that were able to pull off their height. And now in the modern day, due to hybridization and a lot of better nutrition and knowledge and things like that, we're pulling off a lot of taller people and hybrids that really weren't existing very much longer ago. So it's also why science starts making these different terms recently and stuff, but make no bones about it, no pun intended, that if we're talking about creatures and you can step out of yourself as a third person and look at things in a rational, logical point of view, you should be able to look at something like wolves and go through that, or mammoths or something, and then look at people and try to keep the selfishness out of it. So they're not kin really to North American gray wolves or coyotes in any way. And this suggests that dire wolves evolved in isolation from the Pleistocene ancestors of these species. Our results also support an early New World origin of dire wolves, while the ancestors of gray wolves, coyotes, and other wolves, which they have daholes, evolved in Eurasia and colonized North America only relatively recently. So in that statement, we have another idea where these giant wolves had developed from a primordial creature in the Wayback Machine that was the same thing, and due to convergence, they are extremely similar with each other, with a camouflage type skin and pattern that brought about a winter and summer coat. And because they're both northern and all these other things help add it up to it, but due to the larger creatures and lack of there being somebody that was on their ass, if you will, they ended up getting a little larger to be able to take down things in groups of wolves, just like wolves that we think of, but as far as like pulling down buffalo and ancient bison and things, which were a little bit bigger than uh, just recently, and then we have ideas like, well, what could be attacking them? Because you can have other things attacking bison, so they might be on their food chain, like saber-toothed tigers, and it takes a little bit bigger of a dire wolf to stand up to these things. And when there's bigger things around, bigger things happen. And that's just not the way that it happens either. We've realized that during the dinosaur times, and we had these giant insects and so on, that we had a bigger atmosphere going on, and just due to that situation and more oxygen and all these things, that it made dragonflies is 3-foot wingspan, and giant bees and things like that we talked about recently too. So but their results here suggest that it was in isolation, and they support a new world origin for those wolves, while ancestors of gray wolves, coyotes evolved in Eurasia and colonized North America only relatively recently, coming back. And I'm willing to bet that this actually coincides with before the last ice age and then back. And if we were to go back 2 ice ages, then we have that similar creature, and then they're separated in both continents and go through another ice age in its full extent and come out of it. When we come out of it, one's a whole lot bigger than the other, but we're having a convergence happen. You follow me? So relatively, it doesn't look like fingers here. It doesn't look like it sprays out like this. You have these wolves and coyotes that come out here, and way up past my wrist back here comes out the things that's dire wolves, and they come out, but they stop about here and don't continue on to be part of the group that's still going. And I wish that would quit happening. But I'm around 20%, and it always wants to tell me about it. There it goes again. It's almost answering me with, yep. So basically, that's what we're looking at here, is something that from before ends up being something that looks very same as opposed to something that's not. And that can be applied to a lot of creatures. And I think we're going to start finding out that a lot of these creatures that we've ended up taking on as being something is derived from so and so, and are actually hybrids. And then over time you can get a derived form, and due to different locales, different areas, different things that they're facing, and over a long period of time, you can get some variation. So when we look at evolution, sometimes it looks like, oh, well, they just keep changing and changing and changing. No, some of these changes are made from being in different areas, and then the radical changes that develop off that are usually forms of hybridization that peak out with different aspects, sometimes leading to convergence, but in other ways leading to something that ends up looking to ourselves radically different. You've looked at the way manatees run and whales ran back through time and things like that, and dolphins and the ichthyosaurs, and things aren't too far different than that. And there's a lot of things like sharks that have been around for hundreds of millions of years and not too different than they are. There are other creatures that have changed so much, and if you want to believe the human evolutionary trait from where they come, we come from this snail thing that are derived to an amphibian type thing that slowly turned into a shrew type of deal, and then that derived all the way up into the primate types, and one little branch off that came out, and we're a special little branch off that. No, we didn't come from monkeys, it's from the before time, and da-da-da. Weirdly, though, whenever they keep trying to push this idea of Lucy and all these other things that could have been us, they realize that it's not. Yeah. There's been a few others that have been found recently in genetics of certain people. They can show up to 20% of theirs, and it's actually somebody that they're unaware of, like a ghost hominid, as they call it. And we actually have to go through that and try to figure out if we can get any genetics from all the different Homo species and see if we can find traits that will give you that answer for that question. But that's for another video entirely, too. But convergence works in so many ways. You find that, fish sure do look a lot alike in a lot of ways. And some of that is because they're closely related and from little variations on a theme. Other times that's convergence. In fact, we talked about the 31 different crab things that are going on, but you wouldn't believe the thousands of shrimp-like forms that come from all the way to where you can only look at them through a microscope, but other forms, whenever you look at them through a microscope, like when you look at different types of grasshoppers and crickets, you realize real quickly that they're not, oh, they're not almost the same thing, and this one's green and brown, and this one's a little bigger. They're totally different creatures here going on. Wow, when you look at them close. Have you ever seen any of those vids where you look up close at bugs and you're like, what the hell? Yeah, we had this huge exhibit at our school. I mean, I'm talking about it was like could go into a museum or science type thing, and we had it at our school for a few years. And a couple of times, the guy that was a curator for it came up there, and if you were there whenever you did, and in between classes, you could go by and talk to him. I talked to him, and he'd give you this huge magnifying glass with super magnification and get you to where you could look at these things. But be real careful, don't ruin them, don't touch them, and you know the, that type of thing. And you could look at all these different beetles that he's going on. Oh my gosh, this guy had like 1,400 kinds of beetles. And you're like, oh my God, there's that many kinds of beetles? And he goes, well, that's this type. Now there's this and this and this and this and all these shells. It was amazing. And it was all in these little glass cages that looked like something your mom would put china in. So they did this with nuclear DNA, and here's the references that go with it and everything. And I'm not going to go reading the whole thing here because it is quite a few pages of data and stuff. And to get the whole article, they want you to pay and be able to get, then you have full access to it. But here are all these people who have contributed to this article, and that they ibid in the article itself. And so, using things like ancient wolf genome reveals an early divergence of domestic dog ancestors and admixture into high latitude breeds. So the higher mountainous and everything breeds have a different form that goes into it, and they go, well, there's admixture into those. Back admixture from things that separated from divergence of dogs' early ancestor flip. Not like, oh, well, once these started turning more like a dog. No, that happened differently. And of course, we can hardly look back at it because all the breeds that we have going on nowadays, there are quite a few differences in that. So Canis is not actually the species that it's on. In fact, it's Halcyon. And that's the original idea that they had in the first place when people gave that. Well, what does that mean for the dire wolf? Well, Halcyon actually means terrible or dire wolf. So it actually is where they got the name that we use commonly. In fact, a lot of the Latin words that go with things do such. And so we're still left with the same type of situation. But knowing the way that it folds nowadays, that's a little bit different. And where I first learned about this type of thing, I'll tell you a few different times here. When I was a little kid, during times my dad was in the service, we lived out inside of Omaha, Nebraska, where STAC headquarters was. Means nothing, but Henry Dorley Zoo was around there, and they had an exhibit there from also a local other zoo that we had gone and exhibited. And I thought it was weird to go see the other one, but in the other one, it was like, why are we seeing this diorama fake thing? That's all we're going to see at this one place. And it was a little bigger than that, but what it was showing you where they had done an archaeological dig, and just in one little area of Nebraska, in the middle of cornfield world, they found all the species of North America pretty much. And it'd blow you away the fact that they had lions in North America as well as saber-toothed tigers, and they actually had these dire wolves like crazy, but then they had camels, and I've done a video about that too. And all of the creatures that are around here, other than mammoths and so on, they were in North America, and it was pretty interesting. And then we got a coloring book not too long after that, and here we go. And I was one of the generations that really got into dinosaurs. I mean, that happened back in the 1800s when they started naming and so on, and it goes through ripples. Like people getting into Egypt because something's found a little again and it has a ripple, but then dinosaur things did too. And my age, it really rippled and faded out and then jumped back in with Jurassic Park, and everybody went crazy on it again and started trying to learn all the little dinosaur things. It's almost like kids wanting to be a fireman or so on, and you always get this idea now with that effect. And hopefully that'll lead to a lot more archaeology and things that are all, again, just fibrated off, like those fingers there, and variations of these studies, whether it's all animals or so on. sometimes they converge, like when we were talking about the people of the Green Sahara. The guy was looking for dinosaurs in the Sahara, and he ended up running across an ancient people that were in the Sahara back whenever it was green, and they were primordial Caucasians. So we showed in that. You can see that in one of my videos called Mermaids of the Green Sahara, and also the Gobero site, Gobero. So anyhow, these authors' information that they have that goes along with it, and we're just going to let that go here through and show you these ones. And now we're going to show you what this creature would have looked like, just a couple of them, rather than the opening picture that was shown here. So if I go back and just choose images of dire wolves, what we're looking at here in a lot of cases are really just a blown up picture of a wolf, or what it looks like to me really is that they 30% oversized the wolf, and then they turned around a baby elephant and made him hairy. Doesn't really look right in correspondence, and surely dire wolves did not look that big next to a mammoth, unless we are trying to look at a baby mammoth, and there's a big old mama over here fixing to come and knock them the hell out of the way. But dire wolves, always like this, catch one in the middle of a bark and a yipping, and that's a little intimidating, just a little. And these are, of course, wolves that are alive today, so this really doesn't have the correlation to it. Whenever we look at a dire wolf, the only thing we can find is the skeleton. So another place that I found one, and I believe this is probably one from there, is we went out to LA and we were doing things with fish and saltwater and getting hand-picking selected corals and so on. But also got to take the wife around, and one of the places we got to check out was the La Brea tar pits. And the La Brea tar pits has thousands of these dire wolves that they found, and they've got a couple of them on exhibit and stuff and show them, and you can actually see the difference and how they're quite a bit larger and a little more robust, thicker, bigger jaws, head, the whole 9 yards. Really something that you don't want to mess with. You think a pack of wolves is trouble, and then you look at one of these. It's like really the difference between what a real Jurassic Park version of the Velociraptor. Really, Velociraptor is something that's, a little bit less than belt height. But that's not near as intimidating, apparently, as these ones that are bigger. And that's only a variation. Some people believe that that's a hybridization or just a weird fluke that came out of it. But, of course, they could breed for that fluke. So, dire wolves. Yeah. And you always see them listed in showing as winter type, right? But during the last ice age, that would be very common. Here's a depiction from the last age. Here's a dire wolf that got attacked by a giant rock eagle type. Yeah, so there were giant eagles too. It's kind of good we don't have all these giant things around anymore. As people start lamenting for all the creatures that are leaving, we are now finding that we never knew all these creatures that were here before, and it all happened. And we're realizing that thousands and millions of species have come and gone and evolved and turned into different things, and we're just at a certain point in this. And I think it's quite egotistical to think that it's all about us, and we're causing it. Sure, we're ruining some environments of some creatures, I understand that, and the burrowing owl and all of that. Yeah, I get that idea, but it's not like we can go around twisting the whole world for the burrowing owl, because that's probably worse than it dying off naturally. We're trying to save the environment whenever we don't have the control to the air conditioner, really. Yeah. When you look at the last ice age and coming out of it, the warmest period in the last 10,000 years was 9,000 years ago. The warmest period in 5,000 years was 4,200 years ago, and so on, that we've talked about. So here's a depiction of a couple of their skeletons, the way they looked, and it really looks like a wolf. And you can bet that during the winter times they would change their coats and so on. Did they turn white or a winter wolf? I doubt that, but it would probably turn lighter and darker and mixed. through the summers and so on to be more of a camouflage and work that way, and how these things worked. But I just think it's neat. All animals, I think, are neat, and this is something that's closely related to our dog, and like these snow dogs, like we see right here, and their beautiful little blue eyes. And there's some cool movies about snow dogs and stuff that y'all might have seen. I guess here's a depiction off of it. So Canis dirus is about to get renamed, and it'll be an Anacyon dirus, and be a little bit different, and not look like a German Shepherd that's just thick without a ramp butt. This thing looks more like a hyena. This looks like a Marlin wolf. Anyhow, guys, like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy, and we'll get on to some more information. I just thought I'd share this with you. Some information and some ideal and a concept of convergence. We're going to talk about that and a few other aspects coming up. We've brushed upon it before, but never hurts to brush up on the concept again. Peace.